Hello there, it's Tom here, and this is chapter 35 of Gunnerkrigg Court. Parley and Smitty are in this one. And I chose this title because I literally could not think of anything else to call it. As far as chapters go, this one is fairly light-hearted, but does have some serious parts to it, and I think it does a good job of furthering some of the main plot points. I guess, in the grand scheme of things, it focuses a lot on the main gang figuring out their plans to help Jean. It's been a little while now since Parley and Annie had their run-in with Jean's ghost down at the bottom of the ravine, and we're sort of just catching up on them. Another interesting part about this chapter is that because of the events of the previous chapter, and the mix-up that Cat and Path had, Cat is acting a little bit weird, and it's something that's very much in the background. But I liked to draw attention to it by making the chapter graphic, basically a huge close-up of the part of Cat that's slightly different in this chapter. Now, I like this beginning to the chapter, because we get to see a few of the other kids at the court, and these happen to be Parley's friends. And at this point, Parley is kind of defensive and secretive about her new relationship with Smitty. And we see that her friends, Cookie, the sort of scene-looking girl, and January, the sporty one, kind of give her a bit of a hard time, which is basically the reason why she would want to hide this sort of relationship from her friends. I don't know if it was the same everywhere, but I seem to remember that back in school, when a girl would end up dating somebody in a lower year, especially if they were in sixth form, it was made kind of a big deal of. It was seen as something that was not very typical. And I guess I just wanted to reflect that here. There's really only a year's difference in their age, but I always remember a year being a huge difference back in school. But after that brief scene, which basically functions as a way of conveying how Parley and Smitty's relationship has developed, we head to the gymnasium and meet up with Robot, because he and Parley are going to have a little sparring session. And for this section I had a really good time researching information on sword fighting and references for poses and positions certain sword fighters take. And for Parley, as it was mentioned many chapters ago, her preferred style is the broadsword fencing style Lichtenauer. And we've seen in the past that Jean is either a saber or an épée fencer. And before we get back to that, there's this small interaction here with Cat, where Annie casually just puts her arm around her. Something that Cat wouldn't even have registered in the past, but like I said in the previous video, Cat has gone from being someone who is not particularly self-aware to the complete opposite this time, and she's very conscious of herself and the people around her. I wanted it to be kind of obvious that she's working through a few things here. Anyway, back to the swords and stuff. So it turns out that Robot is kind of holding back a little bit, something which Parley doesn't want him to do. But the problem here is that when he stops holding back, it turns out that he's much faster and a lot more skilled than Parley is. And he mentions that the longsword is a heavier and slower weapon than the épée that he's using. And I did this not to make a comment on one technique being better than the other, but I wanted to show that there was a vast difference in skill between the two people. And really, if Parley is going to face off against someone who is a trained fencer like Jean, then she needs to be aware of her limitations here. And so Parley starts to think differently and use some of her own unique skills to set her apart from her opponent, specifically her ability to instantly teleport anywhere, which I think would be pretty useful in a fighting situation. And the idea behind Parley's unsixth bar how that she makes up is that since swords are, in terms of close combat, they are a fairly mid to long range weapon, I guess. So if she was able to teleport near enough to her opponent, maybe behind them or near enough that they couldn't get a full swing of their sword, then she'd be able to disrupt what they were doing. And like she said earlier, she's not really trying to defeat Jean in all-out combat. She's just doing whatever she can to delay her while the others figure out a plan of what to do. So while they talk about that, Annie brings out the Kirti Tooth that good old Coyote gifted her a while back and shows it to Parley. It's basically a short sword, which might be better in close quarters. And here we take a look at some of the properties of the blade, and I kind of enjoyed designing this thing. I wanted to represent something that was so dangerously sharp that even having it unsheathed was kind of dangerous. Basically a blade that was so sharp it could cut a shadow off the floor, which is exactly what happens. And this brings us to the second part of this chapter, where Shadow undergoes his own change. But instead of focusing on Shadow in this part, I wanted to stay with Robot and Cat as they get teleported back to Cat's workshop so that she can fix him up. We get Cat back in her element now, and we have a bit of insight into Robot's character and how his feelings for Shadow have changed over the course of the story so far. And their relationship has been very background, so I thought this was a good time to come back to it and develop it a bit further, which leads to the change that now Shadow is no longer really a shadow anymore. He's, at the moment, still a bit wobbly on his feet, but he is a three-dimensional creature now. Something which we'll explore a bit more in the next chapter. But in the meantime, that draws this chapter to a close, and we see, even just for a brief second, that Cat is back to her old self. And in this bonus page, we also see that Parley very quickly gets over her feelings about being secretive of her relationship with Smitty. And just a brief word on Jan and Cookie here. I've never really liked introducing characters that don't play a larger role in the story, but I figured in this case, because I wanted to show some of Parley's apprehensions, and she is still a young woman at school and has regular concerns regarding her friends' opinions and stuff, I thought it was okay to just have a couple of characters that we may never see again, just to convey that element of the plot that I wanted to bring up very briefly. And either way, it was fun designing these two characters. My problem is that when I do go to the trouble of working up and designing a character, I can't help but feel kind of attached to them and want to do something more with them in the future. So who knows, maybe we'll see them at some time down the road. Maybe not in the main comic, but in some other form or different story. But either way, that's the end of the chapter. Come back again for chapter 36, Red Gets a Name.